Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Glowface Digital Wellbeing Podcast. I am, of course, your host, David Talbot, and I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. It's been an interesting few weeks talking through some different, conceptual ideas around digital wellbeing and what's driving those ideas in our culture. Let's have a glass of water. And I want to continue that today and talking a little bit through an interesting one around how do those people you consider most in the know about technology interact with their devices, and particularly how do those people use their devices with their kids. I think digital well-being for a lot of us extends not just to our own personal interactions with devices, but also to our family, and particularly our kids. A lot of people are understandably concerned with how much time their kids spend on their devices. And look, I don't think this is a recent thing, for several decades, and since the, advent of the TV, I think parents have been concerned about the amount of screen time that kids spend looking at amount of time kids spend looking at a screen each day. And I think it's an important conversation to continue to have, but it's interesting to look at those, who are perhaps closest to some of this technology, most in the know, and see what they do. I guess, what do we mean by those most in the know? Well, I think often when we look at other parts of our lives, we turn to professionals, we turn to examples as to how to, get close to certain goals. If you want to, get strong and sort of build muscle in the gym, or you learn how to do strength training, you will typically look at someone who is somewhat successful in that domain. You'll try to find a, bodybuilder or, a power lifter and emulate some of the things that they do to replicate even close to some of their results. You'd consider them one of the people most in the know about strength training or weightlifting in order to develop muscle or get stronger. So you sort of emulate what they do. You learn from the best in that situation. The same goes for pretty much everything else we do. We if you talk about cooking, you get cookbooks from professional chefs. You try to emulate their recipes in order that you can serve up the similar kinds of dishes that they might serve up. The list goes on and on. You learn to be a good writer by reading good books. You learn to do good podcasts by listening to good podcasters. You learn how those most in the know do what they do. And I guess when we think about technology, who would we consider those most in the know? Who are those equivalent people? And I would look at those people who have at some point been at the top rung of the ladder of leadership in some of the world's biggest technology companies. I'm thinking about people like Steve Jobs, people like Bill Gates, and other people like Mark Cuban, and and a couple others as well. But I want to just take a step back then and think about, okay, what did Bill Gates do with technology in his home? Now, of course, we know he's. Just take a step aside for a second. If you have an opinion on Bill Gates, that's okay. Interesting figure, gives away a lot of money, controversial at times. But let's just take that aside for a second and look at what he did with technology in his household. And he did something interesting. He didn't let his children have a phone until they were in their teens. In fact, until they were 14 years old, Bill Gates decided to not let his kids have a phone. Now, many children have devices in primary school. They take phones to school in case their parents need to contact them in some way. In case that they need to, be available should something happen in the case of an emergency. And so kids young as 6, 7 years old get given iPads, or iPhones to to be able to be contactable by their parents, which is interesting when you think that Bill Gates, someone who, very important man, very busy man, certainly lots of things on his plate to juggle. And one of the conveniences you think he would have embraced would have been technology and his children. But he didn't. He made a pretty deliberate choice to avoid letting his children have a phone. The other one to think about is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was asked in a fairly famous New York Times interview about what his kids think of the new iPad. And Steve Jobs replied that he doesn't know because they don't use iPads. Steve Jobs, the inventor of the iPad, one of the main devices that a lot of kids interact with, almost made a very deliberate decision to not give one to his children. The New York Times reporter in the story remarked how the conversation around the Jobs dinner table centered around politics and history and art and books from a long time ago. And it wasn't the kind of family interaction you might expect from someone who is, neck deep in the technology industry. You would think that perhaps their house would be swarming with gadgets, and you think Steve Jobs might be the first person to have a robot in their house. You kind of envision this futuristic household, when everyone's hyper connected and hyper engaged in their devices, and it just wasn't the case. Steve Jobs seemed to make a pretty deliberate decision to avoid the devices in his house, avoid the very devices that he was responsible for introducing to a lot of other households around the world. The other one is Mark Cuban. Mark Cuban is a billionaire in the States, and he made a lot of his money in media, but also in internet and technology companies. And he negotiates with his son around the use of technology, where he remarked in a podcast that his son gets to sort of earn credits to play Minecraft. And so the more maths homework he does, the more credits or he gets to play Minecraft. How many 1 hour maths homework is 1 hour of Minecraft. Setting some pretty clear boundaries there with his kids. He turns, his daughter has to hand her phone in to him at night after 10 o'clock, so she doesn't spend all night long scrolling and staring at her phone, and she can get a good night's sleep. Mark also remarked how he would literally give his kid money not to play computer games. And really interesting to see, I guess, the quite clear boundaries being put in place by someone who is, again, well entrenched, well in the know about the technology industry and what it is potentially doing to kids. One of my most favorite examples, and it's in my book, is by the founder of Reddit. I'm just going to pull his name up so I can say it right. Alexis Ohanian, I can't even say it right. He's the co-founder of the internet site Reddit. And he had some pretty striking comments about how he wants his kids to interact with technology, particularly his daughters. He said, "My wife and I want my daughter to be bored. My wife and I both want her to know what it's like to have limits on technology. I do look forward to playing video games with her when she's older, but it's really important that she gets time to just be with her thoughts and be with her blocks and be with her toys. So we'll be regulating it pretty heavily. My wife and I both want her to be bored." I mean, striking comments. If you think about what is Reddit, let's just look at Reddit. It's it's an online form effectively that allows people to interact on a whole range of topics. But I think part of what its appeal is it helps people alleviate boredom. You can go on Reddit and go down rabbit holes of conversation and information and spend hours on there alleviating boredom. But the very man that gave the internet the means by which to alleviate boredom wants to encourage his child to be exactly that, to be bored. And such an interesting take on technology. And I guess you look at these four individuals, well entrenched in technology, well entrenched in the industry, and you see some pretty clear digital well-being boundaries being put in place with their family and with their kids. The other one I just want to touch on as a final point is how a lot of these individuals in Silicon Valley actually send their kids to quite a unique school. And the school is called the Waldorf School of the Peninsula. I believe that's the full name. If you just Google the Waldorf, Waldroff, I believe is how you spell it, or Dorff. Let me have a look. Excuse me, Waldorf, just one F. School of the Peninsula. And look, what this school does is it is a completely technology-free school, and it encourages kids to not use devices for learning. It makes kids play a lot when they learn, particularly young kids. For example, kindergarten is just a continuation of playing. They continue to learn and play. And even throughout high school, these kids don't have smart boards, don't have laptops in their rooms, don't have tablets. These kids learn through practical applications. They do a lot of practical work, and the gardening and woodwork and metalwork and hands-on science. But the key thing is that these schools are absence of technology. And what is actually interesting is that 75% of kids enrolled in the Waldorf school come from families who work in Silicon Valley, who work in the technology industry, who see on a daily basis what technology is doing to children, and they have made a clear decision to encourage digital well-being in their household by going and putting their kids in a school, in an education environment that does not use screens to help educate. And for me, these 5 examples tell a pretty telling story, and that is, firstly, I think around boundaries. Not only are the individuals who, at the top of the food chain, so to speak, the top of the leadership in these companies, setting some pretty clear digital well-being boundaries, but broadly speaking, digital well-being is valued throughout Silicon Valley, with these families sending their kids to schools that do not use technology in their school. And I guess it's a reflection of perhaps the danger of technology in those, in education. I talk a lot about that in my book, but we'll save that for another podcast, another conversation. But I guess hopefully what you can take away from this podcast today is that digital well-being boundaries are hugely encouraged throughout not only the leadership within technology industry, but also just throughout the employees in technology industry as well. Those people who on a daily basis see the need for digital well-being, see how these devices are designed to capture and hold our attention, to really take us away from our lives. And I would encourage you then, if people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs can set some pretty clear boundaries with their kids around screen time, around when they get to engage with these devices. If the majority of individuals working in Silicon Valley send their kids to technology-free schools, what does that say about your kids' education? And the fact that a lot of kids in Australian schools are forced to get iPads, forced to get laptops, to learn. What does that say about our education system? Hopefully today's giving you some new encouragement to set some boundaries within your family for digital well-being, and just to see how those most in the know, hopefully we've learned from those most in the know about technology, about how best to use it and set boundaries, digital well-being boundaries within our families. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk again next week.